American embassies and consulates stormed in violent, deadly protests in Libya, Egypt, Yemen, and beyond. Death to America chants in Iran. With the latest on the growing anti-American sentiment in the Muslim world, here's Patrick Martin, Middle East correspondent for the Globe and Mail, and we're happy to have you back in that chair, Patrick.
Good to be back.
Okay, the latest. What are you hearing?
Well, the uprising in Cairo was not as big as people anticipated. There seemed to be an interesting move by the Muslim Brotherhood to play down things there. I think they got the message from the Americans that if they wanted some financial and other assistance, they'd better play along and make sure that there wasn't some further attack on the embassy as they suffered on Tuesday.
Long phone call between Obama and
There
Morsi.
was, and I suspect it came out of that. But the surprise was Khartoum, which really went up in smoke, literally. And there, of course, you don't have American targets so much. What they turned on was the British and German embassies. And those were in flames the last I looked.
In Sudan.
In Sudan, that's right. So you have anger out there in the streets, but it's being channeled in different ways. And I suspect that in countries like Libya, in countries like Sudan, in countries like Yemen, it's being channeled by people on top as opposed to those from underneath. And certainly in Cairo, we're seeing the influence of Muslim Brotherhood now.
So far, the countries you've mentioned are all Middle East, North Africa. Any indication this is spreading beyond that?
Well, sure. We have signs of it uprisings to some degree in South Asia. We have in Bangladesh, in Pakistan, in the area of northern India, the Kashmir. We see these uprisings and protests there. Iran, you mentioned already, there's been some activity there. You even saw yesterday some strange marches by Shiites in Iraq. Those are people under Muqtada al-Sadr who protested both outside the American embassy for a while and others who paraded through the streets of Sadr City. Now, these are surprising because the groups that generally seem to be organizing this backlash against the Americans are the Sunni Muslim extremists, the Salafists, not the Shiites. They hate the Shiites, in fact. So it's interesting to see Muqtada al-Sadr take advantage of this opportunity just to stick it to the Americans one more time.
Let's go back to Egypt for a second here. The new President Morsi is in a tough spot. On the one hand, there are plenty of people in his population who sympathize with these protests.
Absolutely.
On the other hand, he got a dressing down from the President of the United States. Where's he at in all of this?
Well, he seems to be walking this fine line, and he has today, there's evidence now, because he's told the protesters to calm things down, to disperse, protest outside your own mosque if you like, but let's not all rally at Tahrir Square. Tahrir, as you know, is just around the corner from the American embassy. It's a short hop from there. If the mob gets all worked up there, they can march right over rather quickly. He also took steps today, or at least the administration took steps today, to protect the embassy further. They erected a big concrete barrier, very large concrete wall, much as they had last year in protecting the Ministry of the Interior. I was there for riots outside the Ministry of the Interior. Those are very effective barriers, very tall, very hard to scale. And those were now ringing the American embassy, which is just around the corner also from the Canadian embassy.
These demonstrations / protests / mob revolts, whatever you want to call them, started on 9/11, the 11th anniversary of the 9/11 tragedy. Is there any evidence that these events are being sponsored by non-state actors like Al-Qaeda or troublemakers like Iran?
I think there's no question it's being orchestrated by someone. You know, someone had to take that video, that hideous video, that trailer of it, dub it into Arabic and put it on air so that people could see it in Libya and Egypt. And the station that it aired on was a Salafist-oriented station. So we can conclude from that at least some Salafist parties were interested in exposing this thing. The reaction was a few days later on 9/11. And again, I can't imagine there was a coincidence in things like this. There are few coincidences in the Middle East. There's usually a reason for some of it. So yes, I think it was one more effort to show the Americans how much the contempt they have for them, that on their day of memorial, they were going to hit them again. I think in Libya, it was particularly acute because there you've got an awful lot of militias running around, religious-oriented militias. There really is no law and order, especially in eastern Libya right now. Despite the presence of a government, there's no army. And so militias are really ruling the day, some of them supported by the government, some not. These guys wanted to make a play. In my view, they wanted to make a play for power. And one way to do it was to show their strength to their fellow citizens. We can do this to the Americans. You better come with us.
You referenced the video in your last answer. And for people who haven't seen it yet, it's going to be hard to see it now because YouTube's taken it down. And I know I tried to watch it today. And
had you seen it before?
I had not, and it was impossible to see it. But can you tell us a little bit about it? What's in it?
Well, you see these it looks like a dress-up game that some high school has put on. It looks like fake beards. It looks like certainly fake costumes and fake sets. And these actors are reading their lines in very stoic American English as opposed to anything resembling Arabic. Now, it was dubbed in Arabic, so people in that part of the world are seeing it, with that language intact. But what you see are pictures of these stereotypical goofy characters. And Muhammad is portrayed as a very as a very naive, youngish man who seems to be jumping from one bed to another bed to another bed all the time. Women, men, didn't matter. He's shown all over the place. So he's seen as this kind of womanizer and philanderer. He's also seen as somebody who relishes the idea that infidels, including Christians, will be killed. He loves that part of it. And what the film actually, or at least the trailer opens with, are scenes of Christians being slaughtered. And the police in Egypt standing by and watching it, which gave us some hint as to where the origins of this whole thing came from. That is somebody in Egypt who wanted to slam the Muslim movement in that country because the Coptic Christians feel endangered. And sure enough, we now find that the guy behind the film was a Coptic Egyptian.
Mm-hmm. A bloodthirsty, bisexual, blasphemous Muhammad.
That's about it.
That's it.
Yeah, and even looks stupid.
Is there any question in your mind that the protests that we're seeing are a direct result of this video?
I would say that there's no doubt in my mind that an awful lot of people are agitated by this. And that's the everyman, and especially every young man, who may be unemployed, who may be looking for something to complain about, who may resent the Americans for one reason or another. Here's an opportunity, and they've seen it before with the cartoons. They've seen it with pissing on the Quran. They've seen it with burning the Quran. The community are waiting for anybody in the States to do something against their religion. Here's another example. Doesn't matter that it's this ridiculous little film made by some ridiculous little people. The Americans are going to get blamed for this thing. And what you have is a real sense of outrage that the one thing we can count on, they say, our faith, you're peeing on again. And so for that reason, I think there's a lot of individuals who are upset about it. But the movements to strike at the embassies, the kinds of protests we're seeing, are orchestrated by people above that who know these guys are stirred up. Now let's move the crowd in our direction.
So some spontaneity, but the tactical use of rage and fury, which has a long history in the Middle East, is at play again, you think?
Absolutely. We saw it in Afghanistan, in 2010, when there was the incident of Terry Jones, the pastor in the United States who wanted to burn the Quran. There was riots in Afghanistan and many other places in protest to that. And in where was it? One of the towns in Afghanistan, there was a protest broke out there. Local organizers used those protests as cover to attack the UN compound and kill many of the UN personnel.
Take a swig of water if you need, because I'm going to read something here. Shadi Hameed in foreignpolicy.com from earlier this month. It is sometimes difficult for Americans to understand just how deep-seated Middle Eastern anger is. Some of it is illegitimate, but much of it is at least based on things that have actually happened. Algerians will bring up 1991, when what was then the region's most promising democratic transition was aborted by a Western-backed military coup. Iranians will often bring up 1953, when their democratically elected prime minister was toppled in a CIA-sponsored coup. These dates, far from a remote, forgotten history, are very much alive for those who still suffer the consequences of those tragedies. Anti-Americanism can diminish, and probably will, but to expect an overnight transformation is fantasy. Your thoughts?
I agree completely. I've often referred to the 1991 episode in Algeria as evidence of how Western countries, Canada included, and France and the United States, encouraged the military to take over from the freely elected Islamic Salvation Front, the FIS. I mean, those are examples that people still talk about today. I mean, I refer to them, and local people really hurt by them, because in the Algerian case and many other cases, a lot of people died as a result of that. It was one thing for the military to come in, but that then spawned a civil war in which hundreds of thousands of people died in that country. So we see evidence of American activity in the past, which comes back to haunt them. The interesting thing here, though, is that Obama chose to champion many of those who sought to liberate themselves from the despots of the era. Ben Ali in Tunisia, Gaddafi in Libya, Mubarak, of course, in Egypt, and now to some degree Assad in Syria. What you see there is the President of the United States saying Mubarak must go, Ben Ali must go, Gaddafi must go, and really doing something militarily to assist that. And yet they're not giving much credit by the people who are now free of those despots. Why? Because I think that they still believe that the Americans are supporting a movement that will minimize the goals that they have for complete freedom, for complete religious nature of their states. And so I think those who are championing an Islamic state still resent the Americans, especially in Libya. They are the patrons, they see, of that state in Libya right now, which, as I said, doesn't have an army but is trying to gain control and is moderate. It's not the government of the Islamists. And so they are upset that they're the ones who are supporting and the Islamists are trying to take charge.
Let's talk about the Americans, and in particular how this has had an impact on the U.S. presidential election campaign, which is only a couple of months away from Election Day. Normally, when something explodes overseas, even if it's in the middle of an election campaign, everybody sings from the same hymn book. Nobody tries to play politics with this on day one. Ronald Reagan didn't play politics when the copters crashed during Jimmy Carter's rescue mission in Iran. What's happened this time?
Well, Mr. Romney, perhaps with some ill advice, decided to take on the president and suggest that President Obama was in fact apologizing for American behavior instead of condemning Egyptian behavior in the embassy in Egypt and also the attack in Libya. So and in fact, he based that on a memo that had been sent out, an email that had been sent out by the American embassy in Cairo, in which they said, "We regret that Americans have inflamed the situation and inflamed emotions here by the production of a crude anti-Islamic film." Yes, that's true. However, he sees that as an opportunity to chastise the government and the president in particular for what he had done, which I think was, frankly, completely unnecessary and somewhat irresponsible from my perspective, because you do have a government that was responding forcefully to it. Now, it's true that the president of Egypt did not immediately condemn the action, but you could focus on Egypt in that case, not the Americans. The Americans were right to recognize, as the president and as Secretary of State Hillary Clinton do now, that that film is grotesque and really hateful, and it shouldn't be out there, but it is, and so let's move on and try and stay away from violence. So it was reasonable for them to condemn the film, and at the same time to expect the Egyptians to come in and condemn the operation in Cairo.
But I hear you saying that would-be President Romney kind of booted this.
Yeah, you know, he's been made to look bad, whether I agree with what he did or not, or whether I find that the basis on which he made his comments is accurate or not. I think he mischaracterized what the embassy in the United States, in Cairo put out. I think what they put out was a sensible statement for that moment in time. They wanted to encourage mobs to back off. You know, we didn't make this video, they're telling the crowds in Cairo. You know, some idiot did, and we have to live with the consequences, but let's not burn down the embassy.
President Obama's reaction?
Well, he fired back pretty quickly, too, by pointing out that this was inappropriate behavior by a candidate at a time of national crisis such as this. And so I guess he scores some points. I'm not sure one way or the other it's going to affect many voters in the United States. I think most folks have made up their mind a long time ago where they're going to go. But what it has done is encourage some people in the region to see Romney as maybe just a little less experienced than they had hoped he would be. They know he's not as experienced as Obama or anyone else is. But there is a movement in the region, there is a movement among many people that is really anti-Obama. It comes largely out of Israel and out of other communities. Egypt is very much part of that too, because they think he made a terrible mistake by forcing Mubarak out of office the way he did. Mm-hmm. By that act, he really unleashed these forces, and we just don't know where they're going to end up. We do know that there's a parliament in Cairo that is dominated by the Muslim Brotherhood, a president from the Muslim Brotherhood. We know that the Salafists, who are more even puritanical than the Muslim Brotherhood, represent a quarter of the people in parliament. They're the opposition, if you like, and actually they're one and the same thing. In terms of their Islamic orientation, they merge more or less with the Muslim Brotherhood on most issues, but they're really the loyal opposition in that country. So we're seeing a very sharp turn to the Islamists in Egypt, but we have a hope that the democratic process is going to moderate all that. People in Egypt and in nearby Israel aren't so sure about that. And so they blame Obama more than anybody else for putting the country in that situation. And the Coptic Christians are terrified. They're packing up and leaving, which is why this fellow in the United States, I guess, felt it was his place to make a film as crude as this.
Are you concerned about the fact that I don't think anywhere during the course of all of this, anybody has come out with a full-throated defense of the First Amendment of the United States, which is, despite how appalling and repugnant this video may be, it's legal, and people in the United States are allowed to do it.
In the United States, they're certainly allowed to do it, but you have to understand there's two different world outlooks here. I mean, you have the United States, which is the great champion of individual liberties, as you say, and we have many countries in the West that champion similar values. However, in parts of the world, like the Islamic world, you have a more community orientation, not an individual rights orientation. You have the protection of the community. And so that's the worldview that they have when they see events like this. They say, you're just using your First Amendment rights as an excuse to sock it to us, and we don't like it. I can see their point of view.
Every time we get to the short strokes of a U.S. election campaign, a presidential election campaign, there's this expression that keeps coming up, the October surprise. Now, we're not in October yet, but we're getting towards the end of September. A reference, obviously, to being something unanticipated that happens at the 11th hour that could change the outcome of the presidential contest. Could this be a so-called October surprise?
I think this is going to peter out now. I think this really is not going to go on much longer. The fact that the Egyptians have seen fit not to have a massive anti-American outpouring right now is probably going to set the tone, I think, for the region. No, and when people look at this film, if they can ever find it on YouTube or somewhere else, and they see how ridiculous it is, I mean, yes, it was meant to hurt, but it's just garbage. So I think that you're going to see things calm down a little bit. Nobody's going to take Khartoum and Sudan that seriously. They can be a little more fanatic than many parts of the region rather quickly. No, I think what we should watch for is if anything happens in Jordan, if anything should happen in Beirut. There was some protest in Tripoli today, but that's in the far north where they have some of their own issues.
This is a part of the world where it's awfully dangerous to make predictions about because they almost always
don't
turn out that way.
Maybe I'm wrong, but I think we're going to see this peter out. The October surprise that many thought would be coming would be the bombing or the attack of Iran. Mm-hmm. There are many people in Israel who thought that was the course, and that would benefit America by doing that, benefit Obama rather by doing that. I think people, if they analyze it closely, see that Obama is actually very good for Israeli interests vis-a-vis Iran. He's the one who's brought in sanctions, very emphatic about it. Imagine if Mitt Romney comes to office, he's going to start from scratch. He's probably not going to want to start any kind of conflict or intensify things as soon as he takes into office, because he's going to take months just to settle into the job. So I think the Israelis who are thinking about it realize that Obama's about as good as they can get.
We got a minute left here, and let's finish up on Iran. The Prime Minister of Israel the other day said, "I need the American president to draw a red line beyond which, if Iran goes, America will attack." Obama declined to do it. Where does that leave things?
Well, he's quite reasonable not to have done it, and a lot of Israeli commentators say that too. They think Netanyahu was playing pretty fast and loose with this. He should not have been pushing that. He says on his, the way Menachem Begin once said, my words, my outrage are what gets things done. He might refuse a red line, but in fact, he's still going to make moves down the line because he knows how strongly we feel about it. So I think he wins to some degree on that agenda, but it's been such a push for him. He told CBC the other night in an interview that they're negotiating this red line. That wasn't at all true, it would seem. The Americans reject this idea. Can you imagine if you're a superpower and you suddenly have to abide by some principle that says, you cross that line in the sand and we're going to bomb you? You want to have all options open. You may want to move sooner than that, later than that, whatever, but you're not going to tie your hands just because Benjamin Netanyahu wants you to.
Overplayed his hand, maybe?
And Netanyahu? Maybe? Absolutely. And I think he's being mocked in Israel now for it.
Patrick Martin, it's always good of you to come here to TVO. You've been coming to these parts for a long, long time, and it's always a pleasure to have you back in that chair.
Thanks. Good to be here, Steve.
The Middle East correspondent for the Globe and Mail, Patrick Martin.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.